Have you ever been judged because you didn't look the part? Well, when a famous reporter tried to call out Karoline for not wearing a symbol of faith, her calm and unexpected response stunned everyone. The buzz of cameras and soft conversations filled the high-profile Washington, D.C. studio as Karoline stepped onto the set for what was billed as one of the most anticipated interviews of the year. Dressed in a sharp navy blue suit that radiated professionalism, she carried herself with the calm poise of someone used to tough questions and bright lights. But as she took her seat across from David Grant, a veteran journalist famous for his hard-hitting interviews, there was an unmistakable tension in the air. Today wasn't about political talking points. Today was about Karoline herself. David shuffled his notes, glancing up at her with a mix of curiosity and challenge, his sharp reputation preceding him. Known for digging until he exposed something real, or until his guests cracked. Around them, producers moved quickly, adjusting lights and microphones, ensuring perfection for the live audience soon to tune in. Behind the glass, Rachel Perez, the lead producer, watched closely, knowing this moment could define Karoline's public image. As the final mic check finished and the set hushed, Karoline sat straight-backed, her hands folded calmly, wearing a composed smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She knew David's style. Questions that dug into private beliefs and pushed beyond public image. Rumors swirled in the media. Would Karoline, known for her grace, falter if pressed about her personal faith? David leaned forward, smirking as if to signal he was ready to push harder than anyone before. "Ready?" he asked, more challenge than question. Karoline nodded, her gaze steady, fully aware this wasn't just another interview. This was a test of her core values and conviction. As the red light blinked on and cameras rolled, Karoline took a slow, grounding breath. Whatever came next, she knew she had to remain true to herself. As the cameras rolled, David Grant wasted no time cutting straight to the point, his sharp gaze fixed on Karoline with a glimmer of challenge. "Karoline, you've been the public face of this administration for nearly 2 years now. You've spoken on everything from economic policies to foreign relations. But today, I want to step away from the talking points." His voice lowered slightly, almost conspiratorial. "What really drives you, beyond politics? What are the values that shape how you stand in front of that podium every day?" Karoline smiled politely, leaning forward just a bit. She knew this question. It was one that sounded respectful but carried an undercurrent, a prompt designed to probe deeper, to see if she would reveal something raw or contradictory. "David," she began evenly, her tone measured but warm, "I've always said that public service isn't just about policies or party lines. It's about serving people, and that means leading with integrity and compassion. I believe in standing for what's right, even when it's difficult. Those are the values that guide me." David nodded slowly, tapping his pen against his notes as though weighing her words. "Integrity and compassion," he echoed thoughtfully. "Big words. But some would say politics, especially at the White House, is about compromise, strategy, sometimes even bending the truth to fit a narrative. How do you reconcile that with your faith, which people know you hold close, even though you don't talk about it much publicly?" Karoline paused for a fraction of a second, but her expression remained calm. She had expected this, the way David seamlessly tied her role to her faith, subtly pushing her to either defend or distance herself from it. "David, I believe that faith, when it's real, doesn't require a podium or a speech to exist. It's about how I treat people, how I make decisions when no one is watching, and yes, sometimes politics requires tough choices. But my goal is to make those choices without losing the core of who I am." David raised an eyebrow, leaning in just a little, sensing an opening. "But don't you think it's a little contradictory? I mean, you're here representing an administration that's been accused of being divisive, even hostile on certain issues, and yet you talk about compassion. How do you hold both in tension? And more importantly, how does your faith, which you never seem to wear openly, play into that? Shouldn't faith be seen if it's real?" There it was, the first real strike, wrapped in a polite question. Karoline met David's gaze without flinching, her hands still resting gracefully on the table. Faith doesn't always shout, David, she said quietly but firmly. Sometimes it stands firm and speaks when it's needed, and sometimes it's shown in choosing dignity when others expect to fight. I don't believe faith is a show for others. It's a standard I hold myself to, even when no one notices. David leaned back slightly, studying her, clearly not expecting such a composed answer. David's eyes glinted with a mix of curiosity and sharpness as he leaned in, deciding it was time to go for the jugular. "Karoline," he said, voice smooth but laced with an unmistakable edge, "you talk about faith like it's some quiet internal compass, but here's what I don't get. For someone who claims to value faith so deeply, you don't exactly wear it on your sleeve, do you? No cross, no scripture quotes in your speeches, no public declarations. Isn't that a little convenient, a way to keep people guessing so you don't have to commit?" The room stilled, and for a moment even the sound of the humming lights above seemed to fade. Karoline sat perfectly composed, but inside she could feel the weight of the question. She knew what he was doing. He was painting her as inauthentic, as someone who only mentioned faith when it was politically useful. And she knew the audience watching would be waiting to see how she'd respond. David didn't stop there. Emboldened by her silence, he pressed on. "Look, I'm just saying, there are a lot of people, voters, supporters, who do wear their faith proudly, who post Bible verses, who pray publicly, who talk about God's role in their lives. But when it comes to you, it's quiet, almost invisible, and to some, that feels like you're hiding it. Maybe because it's inconvenient for politics?" Karoline inhaled softly, but her gaze never wavered from his. She had faced tough questions before, but this one wasn't just about her. It was about a deeper cultural expectation that faith had to be loud, performative, to be real. And she wasn't going to let that false premise go unchallenged. "I think that's a fair question, David," she said finally, her tone calm, yet laced with quiet authority. "But let me ask you this. Since when did faith become about proving something to the world? Since when did wearing a cross or quoting a verse become the measure of a person's relationship with God? My faith isn't a badge. It's not something I perform for cameras or voters. It's something that guides my life, in how I speak to people, how I treat people who disagree with me, and how I handle moments exactly like this one." David tilted his head, clearly not expecting that level of directness. "But Karoline," he pushed again, "how do people know it's real if they can't see it? If they can't measure it?" Karoline gave a small, knowing smile. "David, if the only way to recognize faith is to see it on a t-shirt or in a headline, then maybe we've forgotten what real faith looks like. I don't answer to public opinion on this. I answer to my conscience and to God. Faith isn't about symbols. It's about substance, about showing compassion when it's easier to attack, about telling the truth when it costs you something, about holding on to integrity when the pressure is to compromise." She leaned forward slightly now, her voice soft but sharp enough to pierce through the tension. "I don't need to shout my beliefs from the rooftops to know they're real, and frankly, the louder people shout, the more I wonder who they're trying to convince, others or themselves. I'd rather let my faith be seen in how I treat the people around me, in how I lead, in how I make decisions that affect real lives, not just in words but in action." For a moment David said nothing, blinking as though weighing her words. The crew behind the cameras completely still, waiting to see if Karoline would falter. But she didn't. She sat rooted, calm, unshaken, and as David leaned back slightly, adjusting his papers, it was clear Karoline had not only held her ground, she had just turned the question back on him. Karoline sat back slightly, her posture relaxed but her gaze steady and unflinching. The quiet that followed was intentional. She was gathering her thoughts, not to craft a performance but to deliver something deeper, something that cut through the assumptions laid out before her. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and measured, carrying a quiet strength that filled the room. "David, I think we live in a time when people have confused the appearance of faith with the practice of faith. Somewhere along the way we've been taught that if it isn't loud, it isn't real, that if you don't wear a cross around your neck or post Bible verses on social media, you must be lacking in conviction. but I don't believe faith was ever meant to be a show." Her words were soft, but they resonated with a quiet authority that was impossible to ignore. For me, faith is not something to prove to the world, it's something I live by. It's the decisions I make when no one is watching. It's how I treat the people who work for me, not just those who agree with me, but especially those who don't. It's how I carry myself, when I could choose pride but instead choose grace. It's in the way I speak about people, whether or not the cameras are on. That is faith. David, still holding his pen, looked as though he wanted to interrupt, but Karoline pressed on, her voice gaining more quiet intensity. "Let me ask you, David, when did faith become a performance for the approval of others? Because if that's what we've reduced it to, we've lost sight of its meaning. Faith is not about signaling virtue. It's not about impressing the world. It's about who you are when no one is around to clap for you. It's about conviction that doesn't bend under pressure. Not because you want applause, but because it's right." The room was still, everyone frozen as Karoline continued. "My faith teaches me to walk humbly, to love deeply, to seek justice quietly but firmly. And I'll tell you this, David, if my faith is ever only visible when people are watching, then it's not faith at all. The test of belief isn't in how loudly you declare it. It's in whether you live it out when no one is watching and when doing so costs you something." Her eyes softened just slightly, but her message was firm. "So if people don't see me parading my beliefs, maybe that's because I'm more focused on living them. I would rather be known for how I treated others, for what I stood for when it was hard, than for wearing a symbol around my neck." Karoline had answered not with anger, but with truth. David shifted in his seat, clearly unsettled by Karoline's calm but powerful answer. The silence that had followed her words was thick, but now he leaned forward, narrowing his eyes slightly, trying to regain the control he felt slipping away. "Karoline, you speak eloquently about faith being internal, about it being lived quietly. But don't you think that's a bit convenient? I mean, anyone can claim to live a private faith, but how does the public know it's real if there's no outward sign? How do we know it's not just a cover, a way to say all the right things but avoid accountability?" His words were carefully crafted, laced with just enough skepticism to sound reasonable but still aimed like a dagger meant to pierce her calm. The crew exchanged glances, sensing the tension rising again. David wasn't finished. "Look," he continued, gesturing around as if inviting the room to agree with him, "you're a public figure, you represent values to the nation. Don't you think you owe it to people to show them what you believe? Isn't hiding behind this private faith just a way to dodge the hard conversations?" Karoline's face didn't change, but a flicker of understanding passed through her eyes. She had seen this tactic before, a mix of challenge and bait, designed to force her into defensive territory. But instead of recoiling, she folded her hands gently on the table, her eyes steady, her posture composed. David, sensing she wasn't going to jump at his words, tried another route. "Let me put it this way, there are a lot of people who see faith as action, as taking a public stand, as speaking out when it's uncomfortable. Isn't staying silent, isn't keeping it private actually a betrayal of faith itself? Aren't you supposed to speak up, especially in today's world?" The accusation was clear now, the challenge fully formed. If Karoline wasn't publicly showcasing her faith, did that mean she lacked the courage to stand for it? A murmur rippled through the studio. The producer shifted in the back, watching closely, while a camera operator subtly leaned in to make sure every word was captured. David thought he had her, that his relentless pressing would finally push her to the defensive, that she might stammer or falter under the weight of public expectation. But Karoline remained still. She listened carefully, her calm only deepening. She took a slow breath, waiting until David had fully laid out his trap, until the room was once again hushed and waiting for her next move. When she finally leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on David's with a quiet resolve. Everyone in the room knew she wasn't about to break. If anything, she was about to give him an answer that would challenge his assumptions more than he could imagine. Karoline took a steady breath, her eyes fixed on David with unwavering calm. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her response. When she spoke, her voice was clear, not raised, not defensive, but carrying a quiet authority. "David, I understand what you're asking, and I understand why people think that faith has to be something loud, something that comes with a sign, a slogan, or a speech. But real faith, at least to me, isn't about putting on a show for others to judge whether you're good enough or bold enough. It's about what you do when no one is watching. It's about the way you treat people when there are no cameras, no headlines, and no applause waiting for you." Her gaze softening slightly, but her conviction only growing stronger. "You know, I've met a lot of people who talk about faith loudly, who wear every symbol, say every right word, but behind closed doors their actions don't match. And I decided a long time ago that I didn't want to be someone who talked about values. I wanted to live them. Whether anyone saw it or not." David shifted in his chair, but Karoline didn't give him space to interrupt. Her voice carried on, steady and resolute. "I think sometimes, especially in public roles like mine, there's pressure to perform to make sure everyone sees what you believe, but I don't believe faith is a performance. It's not about proving something to the world. It's about being anchored to something deeper than public approval. Because if your faith depends on applause, then what happens when the applause stops? Who are you when people disagree with you, or when you're standing alone?" The room was still, her words resonating more deeply now. Karoline's eyes searched David's face, not with challenge, but as if inviting him to see beyond the image he had painted of her. "Faith is why I show kindness even to those who disagree with me. It's why I fight for the people I serve even when no one notices. It's why I try to treat every person with dignity, whether or not they share my beliefs. You see, for me, faith is the reason I don't have to prove anything to anyone, because I know who I am, and I know who I answer to. That's enough." Her last words like a quiet declaration, not shouted, but undeniable. And as Karoline leaned back slightly in her chair, her hands still gently clasped, the room remained silent, the weight of her truth undeniable. It wasn't just an answer to David's challenge, it was a profound reminder that the deepest convictions often don't need to be shouted to be real. For a long moment after Karoline's powerful response, the studio was utterly silent. David, who had entered the interview brimming with confidence and control, now sat slightly back in his chair, clearly thrown off by the quiet strength of her words. The crew behind the cameras exchanged glances, some pausing in their tasks, realizing that this was no longer an ordinary exchange. Even the producer, watching from the side of the set with arms crossed, had let his brow furrow, not out of frustration, but in recognition that something real, something unscripted, had just happened. Karoline, for her part, remained still, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her expression calm but unwavering. She wasn't seeking to win an argument, and that fact made her words even more piercing. What had started as an attempt to provoke her, to corner her into proving her beliefs in a performative way, had instead opened up an authentic conversation about integrity and conviction. David said in a softer, calmer voice, "I have to admit, I didn't expect that answer." There was no sarcastic edge this time, no dismissive smirk. His words were honest, almost humbled. Karoline offered a small, gracious nod. In the control room, one of the technicians whispered, "She flipped the whole interview." It was true. What had been set up as an ambush had now become a masterclass in grace under pressure. What made it even more powerful was that Karoline never raised her voice, never wavered in frustration. She simply stood firm in her truth, and that quiet resolve had shifted the energy of the entire room. Even viewers watching the live feed would later comment that they could feel the change. That moment when a woman under fire refused to bow and instead showed the kind of authenticity rarely seen in politics or media. As the interview drew to a close, Karoline leaned forward slightly, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her voice calm yet resolute, as if every word had been carefully chosen long before she entered that room. David, now noticeably more contemplative, gave her the space to speak, sensing this was a moment that deserved its full weight. "You asked me how I can claim faith without showing it in ways others expect," she began, her eyes never leaving his. But here's the truth. Real faith isn't a show. It's not about the symbols you wear or the slogans you repeat. It's about how you live when no one's watching. When there's no applause, no cameras. Faith, she continued, her voice unwavering, is how you treat people who disagree with you. It's how you stand firm when the world is shouting at you to change, and how you stay kind when others are anything but. It's easy to put on a symbol. It's much harder to live the truth of your beliefs every single day, especially when it would be easier to just go along with the crowd. David's expression shifted. Gone was the sharpness that had marked the early part of the interview. Now he simply listened, knowing that this was no longer about catching Karoline off guard, but about understanding her strength. And if people can't see my faith, Karoline added gently but firmly, because I'm not wearing it on a chain around my neck, that's okay. They'll see it in the way I treat them, in the way I stand for what's right, even when it costs me. Her final words felt like a quiet challenge, not only to David but to anyone listening. What do you stand for when no one's watching? She smiled softly, not smugly, and sat back in her chair, signaling she was done speaking. David, visibly moved, took a moment before responding. "Thank you, Karoline," he said sincerely, his voice softer than before. "That's something I think a lot of people needed to hear." As the cameras faded, it was clear Karoline hadn't just answered his questions. She had delivered a lesson in integrity that would resonate far beyond the walls of that studio. Within hours, clips of her calm, unwavering responses began circulating across social media, with hashtags like Faith in Action and Grace Under Fire trending on multiple platforms. People from all walks of life, supporters, critics, and neutral observers, were struck by how she had handled intense questioning without anger or defensiveness. Commentators from both sides of the political spectrum weighed in, many admitting they had expected a typical political exchange but instead found themselves watching something far more powerful, a masterclass in authenticity. Even those who didn't share her faith were impressed by her poise, calling her response a rare display of strength without arrogance. Prominent figures, including pastors, community leaders, and influencers, reposted her final remarks, praising her message that faith isn't about what you wear but how you live. News outlets picked up the story, with headlines like, "White House spokeswoman's quiet strength goes viral," and "Karoline redefines what faith in public life looks like." For Karoline, though, the attention wasn't the goal. She had simply spoken her truth, but the unexpected response proved something important. Authenticity, when lived out boldly yet humbly, has the power to touch hearts far and wide. As Karoline left the studio and found a moment of quiet, she reflected on the intense interview she had just faced. Though she had been in front of cameras many times, this felt more personal, more challenging. Being asked to defend her faith without any visible symbol had tested her, but what carried her through was the quiet conviction she had built over years of living her beliefs, not just speaking about them. Karoline realized that faith isn't about outward symbols or carefully chosen words. It's about how you live and treat others, even under pressure. Her calm, respectful response in the face of pointed questions had spoken louder than any defense could. Walking away, she knew she had remained true to herself while showing others that strength doesn't have to be loud and conviction doesn't have to be defensive. The interview wasn't just a public conversation, it was a personal moment of clarity. And as she stepped outside, Karoline felt a deep peace, knowing that in a world craving authenticity, quietly living her truth was the most powerful statement she could ever make. The story of Karoline's interview teaches a profound lesson about authenticity and inner strength. In a world where people often expect outward symbols to validate belief, Karoline reminds us that true conviction doesn't need to be worn, it needs to be lived. Despite facing tough personal questions meant to provoke her, Karoline stayed calm and steady, showing that real faith and values are reflected in how we act, not in what we display. Her quiet strength under pressure demonstrated that you don't have to shout to be heard, and you don't need to prove yourself when you're secure in who you are. Most importantly, Karoline's example teaches that living authentically and standing firm in your beliefs, even when questioned, can leave a deeper impact than any debate. It's a reminder that grace, respect, and calm conviction are powerful tools in any challenge.